Welcome back, and thank you for joining me for another exciting episode of Coaching in Higher Education. I'm your host, Tim Jansa, a certified leadership and organizational development coach and higher ed professional of almost 20 years. I'm joined today by Dr. Rubina Malik, who is a global learning and development expert and managing director at Malik Global Solutions. I invited her to join us to discuss a topic that unfortunately seems to be top of mind for many higher ed leaders and employees these days, namely career pathways, choices, and development. So how can coaching help people with career growth and institutions to establish better defined advancement pathways across campus? To answer that question, let's jump right in and ask Dr. Malik. Welcome to the program, Rubina.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's such a pleasure to be here and see you. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Rubina, as you know, career pipelines are really baked into how most organizations in industry, nonprofit, and even government operate. But in higher ed, it's a little different story because, aside from tenure track for faculty, there's often really no clearly defined path for advancement or even a talent pipeline at colleges and university, and especially then the staff leadership positions. So what's been your experience with career coaching in higher ed? And maybe you can even talk a little bit about some of those common barriers that staff face when it comes to career advancement that maybe we as coaches can help them overcome.
Yeah, and Tim, this is such a great conversation. I come here with talking about this conversation with two hats, right? So I've spent 20 years in academia, and not just that, I actually am a certified coach like yourself. So this experience actually gives me a unique perspective. I know the pressures, the challenges, and the different culture in higher ed, from the inside, and also understand how coaching can transform individuals and institutions, from the outside. So, for me, having had that experience, career growth in higher education is not just about promotions, not just about getting tenure, not just about I'm going from assistant to associate or to, full professor. It's really about purpose. It's about skills, and it's about navigating choices that align with the individual as well as the organization. So I think sometimes institutions miss that. Like they want to promote somebody maybe because they have seniority or maybe they have tenure versus are they really ready to run a department, do a budget, empower the people that are there. And, the funny part is sometimes I think I worked in the business school. So here we are teaching about business. We can't run our own department using what we know. So when it comes to career pathing, Tim, I see coaching as the bridge between where people are today and then the leaders that they can actually become, as well as not just become, but create, right? Because at the end of the day, when we look at higher education right now, the trends are around, we can call it's the great higher education resignation. A lot of people are going to be resigning, baby boomers, they're getting of age. And the question is, do we have people to fill those positions? So are we creating those pathways? Are we creating sustainability, succession planning, which I think is very important. So, higher education is not all about learning. It's also about unlearning those outdated structures and reimagining career pathways and creating pipelines for the future leadership, in higher education.
I love that you brought up purpose because I think that is one of the big changes that has happened in the wake of the pandemic. And of course, there's a newer generation, of course, of employees as well. But I think the pandemic was a big reckoning for a lot of employees who finally saw that, number one, working from home is actually possible and preferable and enjoyable. So there are different working modalities. Yeah. But this whole idea about finding purpose in their job is something that I think our institutions, by and large, have not done a very good job providing. So I think as coaches, working with clients to help them kind of identify what their purpose is, what their values are. And you mentioned skills, which is also this whole question of transferable skills. When you're in higher ed, it's a lot about your position, your title, your rank, your job description, and that kind of defines you. But there are very few mechanisms in place that help you discover, what are your transferable skills? What else can you do? And I think coaching is so uniquely set up to actually help people discover what they may not know. And unfortunately, this has now resulted in this whole, you call it the great resignation, and it's true. There are a lot of people leaving. The loyalty that a lot of folks in the past have felt toward their institutions is pretty much gone. But there's another aspect to it that I just read about and that really made me think is that we're always talking about the future of work, but we haven't really reckoned with the past. What has happened in the wake of the pandemic? Why are we in this situation? Why are so many folks leaving higher ed? And I think that's so important to figure out so we can actually retain them. So what I'm seeing is that it's not just staff members, but also a lot of faculty members who are trying to look for employment elsewhere, seeking some greener pastures. Is that something you're observing as well? And what can a coach do to support those folks who might be looking elsewhere?
Yeah, Tim, like really great observation and a great question. And yes, I'm definitely seeing a trend around, academics exploring careers in the industry, nonprofits. And oftentimes, what I'm finding is that, they're burnt out, they have limited advancement opportunities. And, sometimes it's political in the office, so they might not have those opportunities. And I'm just going to call a spade, right? And then sometimes there's funding pressures, and sometimes there's that desire to have flexibility, which they may not have. Although I like to think, for me, I did have that flexibility, but some don't, especially if they're going towards that tenure and they have to be constantly writing. So, yeah, it's a real trend. In 2020, the Chronicle of Higher Education actually did a survey. And in that survey, more than half of the faculty members were actually considering retiring or changing their career. And this connection actually comes from the big issue, as I said earlier, the great higher education resignation. So many of them are looking at retirement, and in some disciplines, we actually don't have enough PhDs to fill that pipeline and replace them. So what is higher education going to do? And I do believe that that's where coaching is very critical, Tim, right? So we can help people see their transferable skills and highlight those, and it help them to reframe their professional identity. I'm just no longer Dr. Malik or Professor Malik. Who am I now? And how do I bring what I've done outside of the institution? And like for myself, I was a little fortunate in the sense that I actually spent time in corporate America, and then went into academia, and now out of academia. So I was able to bring that in and, have that as a background for myself. But, a lot of academics don't have that. So that's why it's really critical that they actually work with a coach or work with someone to help them to gain that confidence. So sometimes we need someone to give us an ear, listen to us and say, no, hold on. You doing X, you can do Y somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So we just want to be able to tell our story more confidently. And sometimes that story comes from outside. We come from inside to be able to tell outside that, hey, this is who I am. I'm not just an academic, that I bring more to the table. Personally, I believe that coaching makes the skills that were invisible visible. So those skills and those strengths and those possibilities that people don't even realize that they've had. Tim, we all, right? I'm sure even for yourself, right? Did you think I can be an entrepreneur? I know I have a PhD and I have the skills, but I'm sure that you also needed someone to say, hey, this is how you can use what you know outside. So I think coaching is very critical when we're talking about people that are transitioning out or actually thinking about transitioning out and helping them to really be empowered. For those that are listening and working in higher education, I really invite you, what skills do you already have that are transferable? Really look at what you have. And if not, if you can't sort it out, get in touch with a coach that works in the higher education arena where they know what's happening and they know how to transfer those skills.
You mentioned reframing professional identity, and I just had another conversation with another guest where we talked about that same thing, because especially faculty have such deep subject matter expertise, and that really defines who they are by and large, not just as academic professionals, but almost like who they are as people. It's kind of sad sometimes when you think about it. And there's the other thing that, as far as faculty is concerned, that's what I call the faculty leadership trap. Faculty who do get a PhD, of course, not everybody has a PhD, and especially administration, non-academic administration, middle management, so forth. A lot of people don't have PhDs, but those who do go through that process, it's really all about them, right? It's about their dissertation, their research, their publications, conference presentations, their advancement, their tenure promotion, all these things. And all of a sudden, they are given the opportunity to move into a leadership position, but they're so completely ill prepared for it. So that's another challenge there. And again, there is a pipeline with faculty, but there's not sufficient preparation along that pipeline. Now, on the staff side, the non-academic staff side, it's a very different story. And people I have met, I have worked with, even including myself, a lot of times there is no succession planning built in whatsoever. You get hired into a particular position. It's your job description, your title, your pay, your rank, whatever team you're in. And you can't move in and out of that unless you leave the institution altogether, work somewhere else, come back and get into a higher position potentially. So it's really annoying. And another thing that I've noticed, and I heard the story just yesterday through a client, is that if staff have an opportunity elsewhere and they want to ask for a retention counteroffer, they don't get it. In fact, some handbooks say staff do not get retention offers. And that is such nonsense, really, when you think about it. Rubina, apart from the faculty side, what's your experience working with non-academics, with, let's say, middle managers, people who are on the administrative track, and how do you potentially tailor your approaches to work with the staff, the non-academic staff, versus the academic faculty?
First of all, Tim, as you know, coaching isn't just a one size fits all, right? So I'm not how I'm going to coach you or I'm going to have coaching someone else. So everything is going to be different. So I think when you look at academics, let's talk from there. We might look at them through who they are as, their research identity or their autonomy and that tenure professor. So sometimes when I'm working with academics, there's a lot of inquiry driven. Who are you? What is it that you want? And, is this the process that you want to go through? But for the professional staff, it really is about having to navigate bureaucracy. Sometimes it's political, and it's building that leadership presence, and as well as finding that clarity in your purpose and your career pathways that sometimes aren't always defined. You're in the same position for decades, and nobody's tapped you on the shoulder and say, hey, you know what, you've done X, Y, and Z. We would like to help to see how we can take you to another role. When we're looking at research, research shows that academics often cite workload and resource challenges. But when we're talking about the staff, what they talk about is limited development opportunities and feeling unheard. So sometimes what happens is, coaching really helps both groups, but really the staff to give them different tools to help them to really gain clarity, growth, and momentum in their career where they feel like there isn't any. And I think that's a real statement inside of higher education.
And I think there's some tremendous development and coaching opportunities also when you move up the chain of command, because as you know, a lot of times there is this staff climate survey. They might go out once a year if you're lucky, maybe once every 2 or 3 years, or not at all. And then nothing really happens with it. So it's just, what's happening with all the data they're collecting. And, that's also very deflating and very demotivating for a lot of staff. And thank you for delineating so clearly the difference between what concerns faculty or what makes faculty decide to leave. You said workload and resources versus staff, really this limited development and feeling unheard. On the faculty side, I can see it's tricky because resources are tied to a lot of things that they can't control, even the institution can't control. Workload is also tricky to address. But when you talk about limited development, limited opportunities to advance, to learn, and then feeling unheard, these are some structural issues that I believe we as coaches can assist institutions to address head on relatively clearly if they're willing to listen and willing to take those steps. So I really appreciate you pointing these out, and also the fact about navigating bureaucracies and so forth. So it's really important.
And Tim, I want to go back to an earlier point that I made. We've got to get out of the old way of how academia was run. Okay, fine. I love to watch British shows and old shows, and you've got like these academics that are sitting in their office and researching and talking. Those times are gone. And, like, I'm just going to reiterate it. Like, we've got to be able to move forward, and we've got to unlearn those outdated structures and reimagine how we're going to run higher education. The youth I'm saying youth, the younger generation that's coming in, they're not going to deal with some of the stuff that I feel like we may have. They're not going to deal with, I got to go through this whole hazing process to get tenure. And then they also may see unfairness that's happening, the whole politics and the bureaucracy, as we mentioned. We've got to get past all of that. And we've got to start looking at today, where are we today in the 21st century? And how do we really work with the people that we have today? I think that's really important. We've got to unlearn what we know from the past.
And what you're alluding to is also this whole idea about flexibility and agility, and also how we structure the work agreement. I know there's a lot of talk in the literature where you're shifting from jobs to work to be done. And this is something I'm always advocating in my agile work as well. The job isn't that important. What is important is the work that needs to be done. And there is definitely a great opportunity to flatten the hierarchies and not have grants and contracts, officer 1, officer 2, officer 3, and then manager 1, manager. I mean, this is just ridiculous the way it's been structured, but we're still clinging to those instead of saying, okay, what are the projects? What's the work that needs to be done? And then we assign people, or even give people to some extent an opportunity and the autonomy to assign themselves to certain projects that they feel passionate about. I mean, I know this is a huge ask and a huge lift, and for many institutional leaders, something they can't even imagine, but it is being practiced just like that out there in industry. So why not try to find a way to adopt some of these practices and create more work outcome, purpose-focused environment in our colleges and universities?
Yeah, why not, right?
So, Rubina, I got a question for you, and I'd kind of like to shift a little bit because you have such a remarkable background and truly deep expertise in cross-cultural dynamics. I mean, we're talking across, 8 time zones right now because you're in Dubai. You just shared with me before our meeting, you spent a lot of time in other countries. I mean, you've lived abroad and you focus so much on intercultural affairs, cross-cultural dynamics. You're so adept at navigating complex global environments. So how does that experience actually serve you in your role as a coach when you work with your clients?
Yeah, so it really is an honor and a privilege to be able to do things like cross time zones, as we said. I just spent a couple months in Italy and, had a client there. Obviously, clients in the U.S., clients in other areas. So it's definitely parts of the world, and it's definitely a privilege to be able to speak internationally, be able to go to conferences, and working in higher education is diverse and global. I'm going to use those words. And what I mean by that is, it's really invaluable to be able to work through cross-cultural dynamics. Having worked through those cultural dynamics, it helps me to be a better coach to help navigate like different expectations. And a lot of those, especially around hierarchy, as we know, from Hofstade's theory, a lot of the worlds outside of the Western world is more power dynamic. You got the individual versus community. And so, for me, what I've gotten is how can I help higher education professionals and corporate professionals work through the cultural dynamics as they're working together, being able to adapt to new systems. How can I help to build the leaders? So just because, remember, like I said earlier, it's not a one size fits all. So, we have to look and see, okay, well, how can I work with this individual versus this individual? Especially in this part of the world that I'm in right now, when we're talking about the power dynamics, like being a professor, being a PhD, gives you such a high power dynamic. And then, there's certain benefits that you get with that, which I have my own opinions about too. Like you shouldn't be promoted due to tenure or your position or your seniority. It should be about what you bring to the table. But that's another conversation. But as someone
that's a hot button issue. That's
right. And being someone coaching with cross-cultural lens, it's optional. It's not an optional thing anymore. It's essential because I may be looking at that lens in higher education and to teach them from that perspective. But even in corporate America, I run global leadership incubators, and these individuals, their skills that they need just to work with a team across the pond, across the continents, they need to understand that it's not an option anymore for us to understand cross-cultural intelligence anymore. It's a must. So we have to, whether we're in the U.S. and whether we're in another continent, we have to make sure that we're able to come across and support individuals that feel like they need to be seen or heard or looked at and appreciated. And I think understanding the cross-cultural dynamics really supports that. And that's what I really feel privileged to have that experience and to be able to do that with individuals.
I mean, you have such amazing expertise there, and I think it would have been a shame not to talk about it. But also, while you were talking, I was reminded that, cross-cultural matters. We always think about, across national boundaries and national borders, across continents and so forth. But when you condense it down into those complex organizations that our institutions of higher learnings are, there are so many subcultures, so many silos. Different colleges within a large research university, for example, work very differently. You talked about individualism versus collectivism. I've noticed that different units have different expectations as far as that's concerned. You talked about power dynamics. Even in one institution, one college, the power dynamics or the power differential is kept relatively low. On others, it's truly hierarchical. So it's amazing to actually apply this intercultural lens then to address some of these kind of systemic issues also in our institutions. Rubina, to wrap things up, if you were to give institutions and the coaches they hopefully will hire some advice concerning setting up career pathways, talent pipelines, ultimately helping them retain talent and foster and grow that talent, what advice would you give?
Great question. And the advice that I would give to institutions is look internally. You have individuals that already have expressed loyalty, and make sure, as I just expressed, some people feel like they're not seen. This isn't Rubina talking. This is research. So really start training internally. Look at the leaders that you have. Mentor them, coach them. Really have them see a pathway for themselves that. It's not just come to work, do your job, and go home. There's nothing for you to do, but really help them to professional development. And that professional development is more than just, but we got LinkedIn or we have a webinar. There's more to it than that. So that's
wonderful one-offs, right? They're so super effective.
Right. Yeah. I'm not saying that those aren't, but coaching and live workshops and, I run incubators, and those individuals, they love the camaraderie. They love learning from each other and creating that community internally from their organization. So there's many ways to help develop and have your people feel like that they're seen and that you're putting effort into them, which is really essential. And also, I would say making sure you're looking internally at those leaders that you want to develop. And do it early. Don't do it like, oh my God, we have a position open. We need to find someone. Oh yeah, that Tim dude, he seems to always be working. Well, then what's happened, and that we talked about that burnout. What happens is Tim gets Tim does everything. Tim gets burned out. Really, how do we make sure that we don't play politics and spread stuff overall and motivate individuals? I think also, why not add professional development to the performance review and succession planning part of the performance review? Have it be performance-based. Don't just look at somebody just because they're tenure. We've got to start doing better as academics. So is someone really shining? And okay, they don't have tenure yet, but they're really doing a great job. Why not? Let's support them in a different way. And what I can say is coaching is one of those tools that higher education can look at and help ways to engage individuals in their mid-career and prepare not just the mid-career, but the next generation of leaders. So I think it's really important that we start that, and we start it early.
The irony here is what you're talking about is helping institutions of higher learning become learning organizations, because they're really not by and large. So the irony is definitely not lost, I think, on any of our listeners. this is a wonderful spot to end this conversation. Rubina, thank you so very much for your expertise and for your insights and for your wisdom. I truly appreciate your time. And thank you all. If you enjoyed today's episode, as always, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is really important to us. You can find more information on this episode, our guest, and today's topic at our companion website, higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. See you again soon. And for now, keep making a difference, one client and one conversation at a time.